Welcome back to Celluloid Dreams, the Psychology of Film. And today we're going to be talking about staging and performance. So I am your host, Mike, and this is host Matt. Say hello.
Hello, everyone. Welcome.
And today is just us. We had a guest last time, which was fun, but this time we're just going to plow on through the material and hope you all find this interesting about the elements that go into setting up the performance. And we'll get into a little bit of the performance aspects toward the end of this episode where we get to talk about acting. So just to start things off, we're going to set the stage. And the word for that is mise-en-scene, which is French for setting the stage. And the elements that go into mise-en-scene are your production design and your locations where you're shooting. So initially, we'll break it down to whether you're shooting on stage and why you would do that, or on location. And I'll let Matt go into talking about those two aspects.
So, depending upon the needs of the production, films can be shot on location or commonly on a backlot or soundstage. And if we look back on Hollywood classic films such as Wizard of Oz, that was shot at the MGM studios in Los Angeles. You have to create this world, the yellow brick road and the world that goes along with it. Really difficult to find a location in the real world for that. And it's an imagined reality created on a stage that you really can't find outside of being in a soundstage. Casablanca, a lot of that was shot on a soundstage. Same idea there. Singing in the Rain, not only a musical, but you also had the control over rain being on a set. Hitchcock's Rear Window from 1954, an amazing set. I think, Mike, we were talking about this recently, where it was at the time one of the largest sets, if not the largest set ever made for a film
Right.
production. And the idea there being that the apartment buildings could all be seen, each one could be seen through the windows, which was necessary for the narrative of the film and for the telling of the story.
Yeah, working on the backlot and the soundstage, you can create whatever you need to create for the purpose of the film. Obviously, for the Wizard of Oz, if you're doing a fantasy environment, you can create whatever is in your mind. You don't have to rely on something that actually exists in the world. So it makes sense to build it on a stage. Similarly, for Casablanca, it's probably easier to shoot it in Hollywood than it is to go to Morocco to shoot. But also, you have that is sort of an elevated type of storytelling. It's obviously not a true to life exactly how it would have happened kind of a situation that they depict in that movie. So because of that kind of elevated Hollywood storytelling, it works for it to be on a stage, and it makes the picture have this sort of timeless quality to it that isn't bound by the realism of the real world. For Singing in the Rain, again, a musical that's about Hollywood, it makes sense that it would be shot on a soundstage because you can't get much more Hollywood than that. So it works to the advantage of the longevity of those films that they were shot on a stage.
There's certain fantastical locations that cannot be shot in the real world and they need to be fabricated on the set. And as we discussed in episode one of my favorite films of all time is Richard Donner's Superman the movie from 1978. The great John Barry, not to be confused with the composer John Barry, but John Barry, the set designer, created some amazing sets for Superman the movie. Some that stand out to me are the Krypton sets we see at the start of the film, the Fortress of Solitude set. I still see the Fortress of Solitude set in this film. It blows me away. And then the Daily Planet set is incredible and just looks completely authentic. Where are you going to find a Fortress of Solitude or Krypton set in the real world? You're not. So you have to build it. Other standout sets are from the film Alien 1979. You got your spaceship sets. You've got your alien environment sets. Just things you can't find in the real world. And you got to fabricate them. James Cameron's Avatar films, while there was some actual sets made for human actors on set, there's a lot of digital sets and virtual sets. And part of what they did, which was revolutionary with their motion capture program, they actually put the actors in an environment that would simulate what would be in the animated film. So they had the actors climbing and swimming and simulating what the characters would be doing in the films. We'd be remiss to not include Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy and some of the beautiful sets that were made for that film, as well as locations too. They filmed on some beautiful locations and built some gorgeous sets. And then last and not least, the Bond films, in particular the Connery Bond films. And Ken Adam was the well-known and well-respected set designer on some of those Connery Bond films. And some of those sets were just amazing. Huge, massive, cost a fortune, but looked incredible on film. And luckily, with the 4K versions we now have of the Connery Bond films, we get to enjoy them at home.
I just want to circle back to Alien and talk about the importance of the production design, again, being tied in with the thematic elements of the film. In Alien, what we have is a context of a creature that will change its environment to kind of adapt to it, including when it rebirths itself, it forms using a mixture of its own process with the DNA, whatever host it uses. So likewise, the surroundings that it inhabits, it sort of makes that its own aesthetic. So the interior of the spaceship, when they find the eggs at the opening part of the film, when they are introduced to the alien element, they already have a sense of the creepiness of it from just the interior of the ship and the way it all looked because of the way that the alien impacted it. You obviously can't do that in the real world because it doesn't exist.
No, you can't.
So then you get into, when did location shooting begin? I mean, it's always been around from the beginning with silent films. Initially, you were just shooting whatever was there. And then it came back into vogue, though, in the 40s with the neorealist movement, in particular, the Italian neorealists, where post war they were shooting a lot with the wreckage of the cities and all the elements that were sort of as is that they went and shot.
Mhm.
So as American films started to acknowledge that influence from the Italian neorealists, you would start getting some of that element into noir films like The Naked City, which was shot in New York City. It had 107 different sites in New York City that they used for that film to give it that sense of you are there quality. Some of the shots are just man on the street type things that are passing by that just add to the flavor of the film. And then from there, that influence could be seen going through films more generally, even in the American style.
Continuing the concept of shooting on location, 1962's Lawrence of Arabia shot much of the film on location between Jordan, Spain, and Morocco with beautiful results. I mean, that's a film we've discussed already on the program, and just magnificent locations. Sound of Music in 1965 was well known for using Salzburg as a location. You had beautiful locations. They even used a large film format on that to kind of enhance the quality of what they got. French Connection in 71 brought Friedkin's gritty cop drama to the streets of New York, where you had a lot of shooting done in the streets of New York, as well as in France too, but mostly in New York. We've talked about the chase sequence that was shot in New York, very kinetic, high energy, dangerous. Scorsese's Taxi Driver from 1976, also shot in New York. I remember seeing that movie for the first time, was mesmerized by the lights that reflected off the cab and De Niro being on location driving the cab through New York. It's just mesmerizing effect. Then you've got Rocky from 1976 using Philadelphia to terrific use. The city of Philadelphia, you could feel the city coming around to support the lead character in his quest for victory.
In terms of getting into the exotic European locations, you have films like Don't Look Now, which uses Venice as a backdrop for its storytelling, which later was used also in Casino Royale to great effect.
Spielberg took his 1993 film Schindler's List to Poland for authenticity, and it's a heavy film, and having it shot on location where those atrocities occurred makes it all the more so poignant.
And then in terms of natural settings, The Revenant was shot in Alberta, British Columbia, Montana, and Argentina in order to capture those outdoor settings. And they were also shooting a lot in natural light for maybe 2 or 3 hours a day, which greatly extended the production process for that. So when you're on location, sometimes you are paying a cost. You can't control the environment as well, but in order to get those incredible results, sometimes you just have to go to the location. The Revenant is a good example of having all those elements fit together perfectly into the presentation of the story. And you would definitely buy in that Leo was going through all the elements that he was going through in that film as depicted. So what we're getting at here, of course, is that when possible, you want to get authenticity into your film. Going on location is a great way to do it. When you're shooting also period films in particular, it's really going to be difficult to trick the eye as to whether or not you're in some of those settings, in some of those eras with people having all the ornate furniture and the paintings on the walls and all the things that you need that are very expensive items. So whenever possible, obviously, if you can avoid having to build everything from scratch in order to have that level of authenticity, either that the building has it already or the location has it already, then you should definitely proceed with that route if you can control the elements and capture what you want in the camera. Okay, so I think you got a sense now of what we're having in mind in terms of production design and how that will feed into the authenticity of the film. But next phase toward getting into that authenticity is with the costumes that the actors are wearing. In order to, again, get into performance, they have to feel like they are the person that they are inhabiting when performing. So, yes, the environment has to have a certain feel for that, for them to feel like they're in the spirit of the world that they're in. But then the next thing is having something actually on their person to help them feel like they are what we're believing that they're going to be in this movie. So nothing can be more important for world building, especially in science fiction films, than to have the costumes themselves be something that are unique and not something that are like anything you've seen in the world as we know it. So, for instance, in Star Wars, you have to have something that feels like itself, but yet if you can create a thematic reference that relates to our world, then that is even better. So the uniforms of the Empire in particular give off a sort of a Nazi feel, even though they're clearly not the same uniforms as what the Germans wore. But definitely the idea of calling them stormtroopers were meant to reflect our own history from World War II, which at the time was about 30 years before the film came out, which was definitely on the mind of George Lucas when he did it. And you can feel it just from the set design, the costume design, and so forth. Then for the individual characters, they also have to feel somewhat unique to that universe. So Luke Skywalker's initial uniform in Star Wars, he's wearing all white. It doesn't really look like anything that anybody was wearing at the time, so it did still feel kind of unique to the environment. But then as it changes over the course of the films, he goes to gray in The Empire Strikes Back, and he ends up wearing all black in Return of the Jedi. So the colors of his costume actually reflect his progression as a character through the films. And using costume to accentuate what's actually happening in the story is another good way to give cues to the audience, maybe even if they're subliminal, that the character has been changing over that arc.
You touched on the stormtroopers, and I love those costumes. They're intimidating. They don't reveal any identity, and they all look the same. And when you see in the film a multitude of stormtroopers coming after the heroes, it's frightening, and you really are worried for Luke and Leia and Han Solo. The bounty hunters, when we get to Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, Boba Fett, awesome costume. Incredible costume. Then the other bounty hunters, they just look creepy. They're up to no good. And they're just the ideal costume for the role they have in the film, which is to hunt down our heroes and try to bring them to the Empire.
Similarly, for period films, going the opposite direction from futuristic outer space, you again have to build a credibility that the person is in the time period that they are. And we find that in a lot of films that have modern actors, they feel like they belong in the modern day. They don't really belong 200, 300 years ago. So when you get into films like Barry Lyndon, Age of Innocence, Elizabeth, Marie Antoinette, obviously the last one, they're actually trying to do a little bit of an anachronistic quality to the storytelling, but still you want to have those costumes be completely credible, especially if the actresses playing duchesses and things of the like. They have to be constricted and confined in the way that they were at the time, and you have to feel that in their characters, that they feel that repression by their costume. It represents that for them, and it does get the actor where they can get into that mindset as well. So it's very key in those types of films to maintain that credibility. Then in modern day, of course, we have films like Tootsie, where you have to create an outfit that the character would be able to wear that still makes him look like a woman, and we have to be sold on that. At the same time, the more that the character moves through the film, he wants to impress upon others that he knows how to dress, that he is a person that has a fashion sense, even though he's just a guy who doesn't really probably understand it initially. But as he grows into being a woman day to day, he has to figure out that he has to go along with the fashion to maintain his status. So similarly, in movies like Devil Wears Prada, the initial part of the film, Anne Hathaway's character doesn't really understand anything about fashion, so she doesn't really even respect it much. It's just a job to her. But by the time you get to the end of the film, she has metamorphosed into a person that has fashion as a very central part of her persona, and that represents her growth within her position in that industry that she learned over the course of that story, and she gained an appreciation for something she didn't have before. And then with Black Swan, Natalie Portman's character begins as the ingenue who wears white and looks natural wearing white because she's innocent, but she has to get in touch with that darker side of herself that can play the Black Swan. As she gradually changes over the course of the story, she has to be able to wear black as well. She can wear the white. She has to have both parts. And so the story is set up in such a way as to mention the duality of what she's trying to represent, and the costumes reflected as well.
In 2019's Joker, Joaquin Phoenix's title character starts off wearing just regular civilian type clothes, and as the story continues and evolves and his madness becomes more of an issue and his separation from reality, then he creates this persona of the Joker, including the suit and the makeup, kind of similar to what they did with Heath Ledger in The Dark Knight, his portrayal of the Joker. The makeup has a self-applied but more clean look in the Joker as compared to compared to what we see in The Dark Knight. But it's a great example of costuming being used to show the mental disjointment that a character is going through. Another example is The Godfather with Michael Corleone. When we first are introduced to Michael Corleone, he's in his military outfit with Kay at the wedding sequence near the beginning of the film. Later on, we see Michael in kind of casual attire for the day, but it's later on, once he is part of the family in terms of the mob activities, where we see Michael in suits, kind of these mobster suits. And it's a visual representation of showing the audience that Michael's now in this lifestyle. He's no longer a soldier. He's no longer a civilian. He's a mobster through and through. And he's taking things over for the Don who's been shot and out of commission. And then 1997's Paul Thomas Anderson film Boogie Nights. A lot of memorable characters in that film, a lot of memorable costumes. But I think we'd be remiss if we didn't remember the character of Roller Girl because of her roller skates. There would be no Roller Girl without roller skates. So I just had to throw that in.
So yeah, to the degree that Roller Girl's skates are a piece of her costuming, it's also a prop in a sense because it gives her a characteristic that's different from all the other characters. Likewise, in other films, props are a very key component of what that character's abilities may be. Other times, it may just be something they use in the telling of the story that has nothing to do with their capabilities. The ones where we're going to highlight are ones that basically you couldn't imagine the character without those things generally. But before I get into that, I want to talk about Marlon Brando. So, as a advocate of the Stella Adler School of Acting, which I'll go into a little bit more later, he was a person who wanted to take in his environment and make his character operate within it. So sometimes he was known to pick up things that just happened to be nearby that he could use to just make this character live and breathe. So there's a scene in On the Waterfront, I mentioned it before, where Eva Marie Saint drops her glove on the ground and his character picks it up and just starts putting it on his hand. And it's interesting that there's a greater depth of meaning to that action than just the fact that it's kind of a weird element to the scene that wasn't scripted. I mean, if you think about it, go to a movie like Age of Innocence, where the big sex scene of the movie that Daniel Day-Lewis and Michelle Pfeiffer have is she just removes part of her glove and they touch each other's hands. And that's like the most sensual experience that they share together. So the fact that he's taking her glove and On the Waterfront and then he starts putting his hand inside of her glove, that's a very personal thing to do with someone's clothing. It shows that his character sort of got this other thing on his mind that he's interested in her and there's an attraction and he's getting familiar with her clothing.
Mhm.
That was something that, again, it's just instinctual and he did it, but it has such greater meaning when you think about it and give it its context. So he also
Yeah.
picked up the cat in The Godfather on set and just got to where he would hold it during some of those meetings in his office and he's petting the cat while talking to some of the other characters in the scene. So it's just an element to just make it feel like a world that's lived in. And he was really great at doing that. So now getting to those elements that characters can't be seen without. Matt, want to give it a start?
Yeah, I mean, we could have a whole show, maybe more than one show, just on the props from Bond films. But where would James Bond be without his Walter PPK? He's got to have his gun, and that's his gun of choice. And without it, he's not quite fully 007. When you're thinking of the Bond films, you've also got to consider his nemesis, various throughout the films. And you've got, of course, Odd Job with his razor sharp hat that he can throw and hit people with deadly accuracy. Of course, in the Roger Moore films, you've got Richard Kyle's character Jaws, who has these chrome dentures that are extremely frightening. From there, Indiana Jones. Indy wouldn't be the same without his bullwhip and his fedora. And of course, his six-shooter too, but the bullwhip and fedora are far more associated with Indiana Jones than the gun. Getting back to Star Wars real quick, we've got the lightsabers, probably the premier prop from those films. In the case of Luke and Vader's lightsabers, for example, you got Luke's green lightsaber, you got Vader's red lightsaber, symbolizing the good and evil. And we can't forget in later films, we've got Mace Windu's purple lightsaber that Sam Jackson apparently requested and George Lucas happily obliged.
Yeah, and the thing is, the idea of these medieval type warriors, the Jedi, and their lightsabers being a religion and having this Eastern type style of philosophy, the lightsaber blends in with that idea of something almost Japanese. Japanese influences were definitely involved in the creating of Star Wars because the film Kurosawa's Hidden Fortress was a direct influence on the Star Wars story. So Kurosawa was actually a hero to George Lucas. So he wanted to use some of those elements that he appreciated in Kurosawa's films. And honestly, at the beginning, as far as I understand, Lucas didn't really have the color scheme really worked out so well. He actually wanted Luke to have a red lightsaber, I understand. And I believe
Interesting.
others mentioned, isn't red more of something that you would associate with the dark side more than the light side?
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of a
Yeah.
process there, I think, by which they had to figure out who was going to have what color even and what that signifies. So there is
Hmm.
a point to some of the choices that are made, and sometimes they're collaborative. Now, sometimes the filmmaker themselves doesn't even think of all of them.
Hmm.
So another one that's a great example of something that may not represent today what the filmmakers themselves indicated is the red pill versus the blue pill from the Matrix. So red pill is supposed to show you what the real world is, and the blue pill is continuing to live in the reality that's false, the virtual reality. Nowadays, of course, it's taken on this political context that people think, well, if you take the red pill, it means that you're seeing things the right way because now you're seeing it the conservative way. In fact, the Wachowskis are transgender, and being that they are of the liberal political persuasion, they do not approve of the co opting of the red pill by the conservative movement, which is not the intention of the film. But then again, with film, a lot of times the meaning of a film can be taken from the audience in whatever way that they choose, even if it's not the filmmaker's intent. So sometimes that carries the day in how people perceive the meaning of a film. But that's just showing again the importance of thematic elements and putting them into the film with other symbols to represent those things. So the pill idea to convey this concept of choosing one reality versus another is deeply ingrained into the story itself, and they gave it a prop representation. Now, another famous image that involves a prop is Lloyd holding his boombox and Say Anything to woo Ione Skye's a character in that film. So we've talked before about Peter Gabriel playing over that boombox, but the song is probably even less important to many people these days than just the image of him holding it. For those who didn't grow up in the 80s and know Peter Gabriel very well, they wouldn't care what was playing on it. But that image is still very well known. It's so well known, actually, that Ron has released one of these videos recently where a character is holding up a boombox and it's keeping Donald Trump awake at night. So even in Iran, apparently they're aware of what this image symbolizes, and they've used it in one of their little trolling videos that they put out recently.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then when you talk about something that has great meaning in a story, the watch in Pulp Fiction has got to be one of the ultimate props that has deep significance to the story. There's a whole scene in which Christopher Walken is basically telling Bruce Willis's character when he was a child the story of how he was able to deliver his father's pocket watch to him. And it gets into very graphic detail about the fact that he was in a POW camp with his father, and they had to steal this watch away by hiding it inside one of their orifices. And they each got to share this experience in order to get this watch to him so that he would have this birthright. And this watch had been around for years and prior generations as well. So this was a deeply meaningful watch to the family of Bruce Willis's character. So when the one item that his girlfriend left behind was the watch, that was the one item that was the most intolerable thing for her to have left behind, and he would be willing to risk his life to get that watch back. So anyway, but so yeah, talking about a prop that has deep meaning, that one has got to take the cake.
Yes. Clean it thoroughly before use.
Yes. And then finally, in The Shining, the typewritten pages is a prop. So if you can imagine the amount of time that it would take to take this size of a stack of paper and type different variations of all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, and just putting it in different indentations and paragraphs of different sizes, and just over and over again, and what that represents for his character. That said more for what mental state his character was in than just about almost any other scene of Jack Nicholson's performance. So talking about a prop that just speaks volumes, just page after page, and the more she goes and the more she reads, the more that prop signifies to the point of that story.
The One Ring is the one special prop from Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. And from what I remember reading about it, they used different sizes, an actual ring size that Elijah Wood could put on. And then there were large size rings. If they needed a a shot where the ring was in foreground and they had some activity in the background. They had a large ring. And of course, there was some computer generated enhancements with the materialization of the elvish writing that goes around the ring. If I had one of those rings, that'd be a nice addition to my collection of movie props. Not all props are small. Some props are quite large, and a couple that come to mind is the DeLorean from the Back to the Future trilogy. Fans of Blade Runner are familiar with the spinner, the flying car of the future. In the first Batman film, the Tim Burton version, we have Jack Nicholson's Joker asking in a demanding way, where does he get those wonderful toys? And well, Batman in all his cinematic incarnations has a lot of beautiful and wonderful toys and props. And there's a lot of really talented people behind the scenes that create those props, whether it's the Batmobile, the Batwing, the Batboat, the devices that clip onto Batman's belt. I'm pretty fond of Christopher Nolan's trilogy and the gadgets that he came up with, and they're beautiful functioning props, really great looking props. And then finally, RoboCop, another of my favorite films. RoboCop is very much identified not just simply by his costume, but also his firearm of choice, which is a massive black pistol that seems to never run out of ammo. Between RoboCop's amazing targeting system and that weapon's ability to hit its target, it makes for a pretty lethal combination.
All right, so now you've got the clothes, you've got the tools. What else do we need to make an actor transform into whatever they're going to become in the characters? Clearly, if you look at the Oscar list, what's next on there that they give the awards to? Makeup. Okay, so hairstylings, things of that sort. So clearly, it's key. They can't feel like they're in that person's skin unless they have that right. So getting into the makeup, we're going to talk about some fun ones over the years that obviously without them you can't possibly have that transformation. And we'll also get into some of the more substantial transformations that are done through computer effects as well to transform that actor into whatever person or creature, perhaps even, that they end up becoming. So initially, as a child, one of the things that scared me the most, I had this book of just different pictures from horror films of the years. One of the things that scared me the most was Lon Chaney's Phantom of the Opera. That picture was so scary to me as a young child that I would just want to skip past that page in the book every time because just that expression on his face was so stunning to me. And that was from a 1925 silent film. So talk about fantastic makeup. Lon Chaney was the man of a thousand faces, and he certainly broke the mold when it came to that kind of acting.
You sure did, and that I know the character you're talking about. That's a frightening image even by today's standards. What he was able to accomplish there with his makeup techniques at the time. Continuing with the trend of universal horror, Frankenstein in 1931, Jack Pierce was the makeup artist. Karloff had to sit for hours in the chair and endure the makeup for Frankenstein between the first film and then the sequel, The Bride of Frankenstein. Very frightening. I know people at the time must have just flipped out. I know my parents probably saw it when they were probably teenagers, and I know it horrified them. Dracula, little less horrific, but still no less frightening. You got Lugosi with his teeth and paled complexion and his performance, which certainly helped with delivering the character. 1941's The Wolfman, which did something really interesting with the transformation. It's kind of like the original Morph. Morph is a computer graphics term that came about in the early 90s, like with Terminator 2. But what they did is they dissolved between shots. So they would make up the actor and then cut, make up a little more, cut, make up a little more film, and then cut. And then they would dissolve the shots together rather than hard cuts between the shots. And it gave this transition, the Wolfman character actually transforming from a human to a wolf man. And it was very effective.
So then in 1981, there was a huge jump of sophistication for the transformation process. And it's amazing what happened in that year. You had two films that went about taking that werewolf transformation sequence to the next level. The first is The Howling. And what's interesting is the makeup effects person that ended up doing that was originally supposed to be Rick Baker, but he ended up leaving that film and left the task to his assistant, Rob Bottin, who took over and did a fine job of not using anything like a dissolve effect. I mean, you're actually seeing little pulsings in the face and things like that as the creature is changing. He's growing in size to where he's this giant wolf. So again, all this stuff is done on camera in front of you and seeing it instead of doing the morph effect where they just apply something, shoot it, dissolve, apply something more. So they're making it happen in front of your eyes, the actual transformation. So then American Werewolf in London, Rick Baker decided to up the ante even more by not hiding things in the shadows, but making it happen in a brilliantly lit room. So as he's changing, there's nothing that they could really hide in all of that. I mean, you're having limbs stretch and hair coming out, and just it made it look like this terribly painful process. Like as the jaw comes out of his face, it looks
Yeah.
extremely painful. So it's such an incredible effect, and that went on to win the Oscar that year. Was Rick Baker? Both of them, of course, ended up many years of making special effects makeup then on. So they were at that point legends, both of them.
Another legend who we've lost, but we could probably talk about for many episodes, his work is that of Dick Smith. And in 1973, William Friedkin decided to direct The Exorcist, and Dick Smith was the makeup wizard that he hired for that massive task. Dick Smith primarily had the job of making Linda Blair appear to be a possessed girl. My understanding is that he had a great relationship with Linda Blair, who was only 12 or 13 at the time, and she really had to endure a lot. Pre-production molds, all that was going on during the production, hours upon hours before even filming began. And that's with a child. It's pretty remarkable. But to this day, The Exorcist is the only film that frightens me. And Dick Smith's makeup is a huge part of that. And Linda Blair's performance, the sound design, it all comes together for really frightening, horrific results. Scanners, when we think about Rick Baker some more, he worked on Scanners as well as David Cronenberg's other masterpiece, Videodrome. And with Scanners, we saw some really gruesome effects of heads blowing up and bodies bubbling and eyes bleeding. And with Videodrome, a lot of creepy, grisly kind of effects. We have one guy who's shot by this flesh gun, and his face begins to blow out from within. Just a really grisly effect, but very effective. 1986 is The Fly. Chris Wallace was the Oscar-winning makeup designer for that film, and we get to see Jeff Goldblum turn into a fly very effectively. I was watching clips from it not long ago, and it's completely practical. This was pre-CG time, and it's really grisly, it's really effective, and it's horrifying. And there's a sequence where Brundlefly ends up dissolving a guy's hand who's trying to save Gina Davis's character. And this guy ends up getting his hand dissolved by Brundlefly. And you see it, the audience sees it, and it's really disturbing. And then he goes after the guy's foot, and we get to see a little bit of his foot get dissolved too. So it's really creepy. Continuing with the incredible makeup, Rob Bottin was again at work at Ridley Scott's Legend in 1985. And I think I mentioned in a previous episode, the devil character known as the Darkness in that film, played by Tim Curry, that makeup design is just absolutely incredible. Tim Curry's performance, of course, enhances everything. But the sculpt that Rob Bottin came up with, the way that everything was applied and attached to the actor's body and face, because we're not just talking a head and face, we're talking shoulders, chest. It was a massive, basically a suit, a bodysuit. And it's probably the best thing about that film. I know it's a beautiful looking film, but the look and what Rob Bottin did with the darkness in that is amazing. Lord of the Rings, we had incredible makeup design with the orcs and various characters there. Pan's Labyrinth, of course, Guillermo del Toro, he's a lover of the monsters, and Pan's Labyrinth is no exception. There's some really great makeup and creature effects in Pan's Labyrinth. And jumping to more realistic approach, Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight, we can touch on the Joker, carvings, scars in the side of the face, which, interestingly enough, we get different stories on how it happened in the film from the Joker himself, and we never really actually know how he got those scars. Was it his dad? Was it something else? Did he do it himself? But from what I've heard, Heath Ledger was very involved with the formation of the character and the look of the character. And I think that homemade makeup approach between Heath Ledger's input, Christopher Nolan's input, and the makeup effects team on the film, they came up with a design that it really looked homemade and kind of rough, but very disturbing at the same time. And then later on in the film, we get Harvey Dent, and Harvey ends up suffering burns to half of his face. And that was a combination of appliances as well as computer generated imagery, which is something we'll talk about here shortly, where you combine practical makeup effects with CG for an overall effect that you couldn't achieve solely by practical makeup effects. And in the case of Harvey Dent's character, the rotating eye, which is just basically probably holding by a muscle or two, the eye moving around, that's completely computer generated. There's no way they could do that with practical makeup. at least in the application on the actor's face.
In terms of the more grounded approach, for films like Tootsie and Mrs. Doubtfire, where you've got to make a man believably look like a woman, yet you still want to play up some of the comedic aspects of that, you want to find the fine line between looking good enough and not too good. So, the part of the running joke in those is that because they are men that are really bad at making themselves look like women. They just are not very attractive women, and a lot of people end up making comments about some of these things. One of the cameramen in Tootsie, when she was being filmed, the character that Michael Dorsey was playing, Dorothy Michaels, was being filmed. They asked the cameraman how far back would he have to go to make her look good. He said, "How do you feel about Cleveland?" So, yeah. So, and then Mrs. Doubtfire, of course, he's got to make his kids not believe that it's him too, that he's somebody else, but at the same time, he's trying to get closer to his kids because he's losing them. So both of them, though, are dramedies. So you have to have the dramatic scenes work and the comedic scenes work for those films to actually operate correctly. So that was a fine line they had to draw, and they did a good job in both of them, making them believable and yet humorous at the same time. Now, in a little bit more serious front, films like Elizabeth, her transformation over time through makeup is stellar. One of the best uses of makeup in terms of grounded scene of just really talking about the character's arc through makeup is at the ending of that film. When she puts on that mask at the end of this white makeup that just makes her look almost ghostly and ethereal, it's like she's been separated from the human race. She has to look like a ruler that has been transformed under the divine right of rulers to be the queen that she becomes, that is greater than any human. So she has to have all the humanity stripped away from her, and she becomes a very cold, isolated presence that has this ability to rule with inspiration from God. That's what she's going for as both the leader of the country as well as the leader of the Church of England. So, in a sense, that's kind of what had to be passed down ever since then as well, is that the ruler continues to be at the top of the Church of England, and they have to have that quality, but that all stemmed from Elizabeth initially, and that film really captures that at the end. It's a very powerful ending where a person has to become greater than what a human being is to have that capability. So similarly, the transformation of Gary Oldman into Winston Churchill in Darkest Hour is very impressive in the sense that I was not thinking I was watching Gary Oldman at any point in that movie. He so disappeared into the makeup and to his personification of Churchill. That was a stunning film from, frankly, an underrated director, too. So, one of many fine films by Joe Wright in the last 20, 25 years, and definitely worth catching to see that performance, if not all the other things that make up that film. Then Nicole Kidman's transformation into Virginia Woolf in The Hours. Most people, when they see that film with the nose that they applied to Nicole Kidman's face, they see someone other than Nicole Kidman in that performance. Again, to play a real person, even more so, obviously, in like Churchill, people that we've actually seen in real life, but you have to capture the essence of what that person personifies. So her transformation into Virginia Woolf was one of the many great pieces of her performance through makeup, as well as her performance in that film that got her the Oscar finally. In terms of transformations into real people, Charlize Theron, who's one of the most beautiful actresses that there is, has to look like Eileen Wuornos, the serial killer in Monster, and make you not think she's Charlize Theron. Again, did not think of her in that sense. Another one of those great Oscar winning performances that you remember to this day, even if you haven't revisited the film in the last 20 years. Just mentioning of the film, you capture in your mind exactly what she looked like in it and the essence of what she conveyed, and she did it masterfully.
In the last few decades, computer graphics has really come into play with regards to character effects, character creation, and a combination of makeup and CG in certain films. Terminator 2 Judgment Day. The T-1000 was kind of a huge technological breakthrough. ILM did the computer graphics work on it. Stan Winston Studio did the practical makeup effects, and Robert Patrick, with his performance, kind of blended the two different elements together. It still holds up really well, given that we're over 30 years since that film was released. I think we're going on 35 at this point. Cameron always pushes the bounds of what technology can deliver, and he certainly has shown that with the Avatar films recently, and T2 was no exception. From a makeup standpoint, too, Stan Winston Studio also designed and created some really great makeup appliances that Arnold wore. So as Arnold is getting damaged throughout the film, we're seeing bullet hits in his body and face. We're seeing his one of his eyes exposed underneath the cybernetic eye. And the both makeup and visual effects won Oscars for Terminator 2. The character of Gollum in the Lord of the Rings trilogy kind of is a precursor to what they were doing subsequently with the Avatar film. So Andy Serkis, a well-known actor director, was tasked with creating this performance for Gollum. So Andy Serkis wore a motion capture suit. His performance was captured as best they could at the time, and the CG artists at Weta, now Weta Digital, were able to take Andy's performance and create this visual representation of it in the form of Gollum. And I remember when I first saw Gollum, I think it was, we really saw him in the second film, the Two Towers. It was just like mind boggling. And I remember thinking at the time, yeah, that's the effects winner for this year, because it's basically a humanoid. It's basically a organic humanoid character, not quite human, but definitely far more human, like a T-1000. And so it was really groundbreaking at the time what they achieved with that. Then go into the Avatar films, Zoe Saldana as Neytiri and Sam Worthington as Jake, and the other actors that portrayed the Na'vi characters. They wore more advanced forms of motion capture suits and performed in environments that James Cameron and crew set up for them, where they would be running on stage, running or climbing up and down props that would give them the physical movements that were required for whatever the shot demanded in its finished form. And we now just saw the third Avatar film, and the technology they're using there is pretty extraordinary. We're to the point now where you can have an actor perform and have his movements captured, and then a CG representation of that looks photorealistic is created, and it's remarkable technology.
I'm also really impressed by Zoe Saldana's performance in all three of the films. To me, she's been sort of the highlight of the acting performances, even the people that aren't Navi characters. She's been brilliant in that, and I'm glad she got an Oscar, even if it was for a different film than the Avatar films. You know, the motion capture, they're not getting enough credit for their performances. Andy Serkis, we've already talked about for Gollum. He also played Caesar in the Planet of the Apes films from 2011 to 2017. There, he's trying to personify an animal that is becoming human-like in its characteristics. It's just brilliant performance that he can create all that sensitivity of the human part of him that they're trying to identify with. At the same time, he can portray the animalistic qualities of the ape side of himself, and he shows that dichotomy. It's really impressive, and it's a shame that he's never even gotten a nomination for that kind of performance.
Yeah, it's true. He's really extraordinary, and he kind of set the bar for performance capture with the work he and the folks at Weta, did for those Lord of the Rings films with Gollum, and then subsequently the Planet of the Apes films. Another interesting use of computer graphics with practical makeup effects is using CG to enhance the practical makeup. So a couple of interesting examples. Ray Fiennes' character of Lord Voldemort in the Harry Potter films, he's covered up in prosthetics and makeup, and yet in the finished product, we see that his nose is basically like a snake nose. It's almost kind of not there. So what they would do is they would mark his nose or color his nose in a certain way so it stood out while they were filming. And then in post-production, the effects house, possibly ILM, would basically use computer graphics to create what we see in the finished product, where the nose is kind of blended into the rest of the face and he really doesn't have much of a nose. Same kind of technique was used on the Red Skull character in Captain America, the First Avenger. They would color his nose one way for on-set filming, and then post-production, they would make the nose look like a skull nose, like huge openings in his face. Touch back on the Terminator films really quickly. The recent Terminator films with Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of used CG to enhance the prosthetic makeup that was applied to Arnold's face. For example, they were able to not only apply just prosthetics, but enhance it with CG to show further damage that would kind of go underneath the skin. That's something you couldn't accomplish with prosthetics alone. So it's really effective, though. And that kind of technique was also used to some extent with Steven Spielberg's AI, artificial intelligence, where you had actors that were portraying droids. For example, you'd see the face of a woman, but the back of her head was a robot and the rest of her body was a robot. But they got a performance of an actress on set and then used that footage and combined it with a computer-generated robot body for a final result that was really incredible, and it still looks great to this day. And The Creator, another film that kind of used the same technique, where you had characters that were kind of a symbiosis of human and robot, and you would see like a human face, and then the back of the head would be like a robot head, and perhaps part of the body would be a robot head. But it really shows you what combining the two techniques can give you. It's just something that's otherworldly and very effective.
Now, telescoping back from effects to enhance performance directly, let's get into effects that go back into the world building aspect because that's where effects really began was world building. We're going to just touch upon that briefly before we dig back into performance. Initially, the effects were in camera using some of the tricks with photography. George Méliès, who was in real life a bit of a magician, he liked to perform. He saw the camera as a technique to use for magic tricks. So he would use them for effects to make things disappear by just moving that object out of the frame and then restart filming again, or just keep the camera rolling and just cut out that middle section to show that item disappeared all of a sudden, and this is some smoke going up or something. So that was something that he enjoyed utilizing for his fondness for that form of entertainment. One of the early films that demonstrated his wizardry was A Trip to the Moon, which was from 1902. So we're talking early silent films. We're already seeing special effects being used. So then fast forward into the groundbreaking production in that regard, I think is one that Matt will want to talk about a little bit here.
Yeah, King Kong, 1933. Willis O'Brien was the lead effects artist on this film, and his apprentice was actually Ray Harryhausen, who we'll talk about shortly. But these gentlemen and their assistants were responsible for creating characters. And in this case, we have, stop motion characters, King Kong and others that Kong encounters along the way. And creature creator Stan Winston had an expression that said the monsters are real. And what he meant by that was that the characters that he creates, whether they're monsters or seen as otherwise, they're real. When they're in the film, you believe they're real. And audiences in 1933, from what I've heard, because I was born a few years after that, but they were blown away by what they saw in King Kong. And by today's standards, I think young audiences would probably see it and think it's a little bit cheesy. But the technology at the time, this was groundbreaking. Just as a refresher, the idea of stop motion involves shooting one frame at a time. So you shoot a frame, move the miniature, shoot again, one frame, move the miniature. Very time consuming process. It was used to great effectiveness in the Star Wars trilogy, the first three films, New Hope, Empire, and Return of the Jedi. But it's remarkable what Willis O'Brien and his team were able to accomplish in 1933.
So the same principle applies to animation, of course, because you're drawing frame by frame to animate an action, a scene, and so forth. So in Snow White, the first feature length animated film, no one thought that, of course, you could make a film that long that would play. And they thought it was crazy of Disney to even try it. But you got to see all kinds of fantastical things that normally you wouldn't be able to see in real life. And that was the visual effects escapism that we think of today. That was its form at first when you only had so many King Kong films that you could make, or I guess another one would be Mighty Joe Young from that era. But if you wanted to get into other types of realization of different realities, the animated films from Disney certainly went there and satisfied that need. And then science fiction, of course, is another genre that relies heavily on visual effects. Forbidden Planet was a bit of a masterpiece of the time, a bit of sophistication. It actually is a blend of animation and other types of effects. In Forbidden Planet, you have a monster that's pure energy that they literally did animate it into the scene when it would attack the ship or people or and so forth. So there again, the inspiration for what we're seeing for the use of blending of computer generated effects is starting to creep in through the use of the animation. And another step forward, believe it or not, this is a bit of a stunner, but the first use of CGI was actually in a Hitchcock film. It was the opening of Vertigo in the credit sequence. So they're using that principle again of creating these step by step images that are like an animation, but it's done with a computer in that credit sequence.
Yeah, that was something you pointed out to me that really surprised me. I had no idea that the first CG work in a film was done in the 50s. I never would have thought that was possible.
Now, special effects don't all have to just be computer generated or stop motion. There are other ways that you can do them in camera. So Hitchcock was actually a pioneer of doing all kinds of interesting in camera effects as well that are just using the lenses or slowing or speeding up the film and things of that sort. Those kinds of principles are called in camera effects. So the vertigo effect in Vertigo is just a in camera effect we've talked about, which is the dolly zoom shot. where you do a motion of the dolly in the opposite direction as the zoom lens to create an effect. So in that, you're getting the sense of the point of view shot of the character when he's having a vertigo reaction just by an in-camera effect.
Now, touched on Willis O'Brien with his work on King Kong, and his protege, Ray Harryhausen, went on to have a pretty amazing career in his own right. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms from 1953, Clash of the Titans from 1981. I remember that film really well. I was 10 or 11 at the time and saw it in the theater, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever. Haven't seen it in a long time, but the child in me wants to look at it again.
Yeah, the effects do look a little bit dated in it. It's still fun. I
Yeah.
mean, it was also one of my initial exposures to Greek mythology in film, and for that, I it has a special place for me all the same. But yeah, I mean, it was still something that was a throwback to the 50s and 60s type films that he was doing.
So when we're talking about practical effects, we'd be remiss if we didn't bring up Stanley Kubrick's 2001 from 1968. Here's a film that came out nearly a decade before the first Star Wars film, A New Hope. And I just recently watched 2001 not long ago on 4K. And it's such a stunning, beautiful picture. The effects work, the miniatures that they built for that film, which were pretty large scale miniatures, and they were filming on large format film. So the quality of the miniatures, the quality of the resolution that they ended up with just lends itself perfectly to 4K home video enhancement. But 2001 really broke new ground, and one of the premier effects artists that worked on the film was Douglas Trumbull, who was given a lot of freedom by Stanley Kubrick to come up with a lot of the way the shots were created, not only miniature shots, but also shots inside the spacecraft. Trumbull did a lot of work with creating these cell animated screens that were in the spaceship. That's not computer graphics. That's all graphics he found and colored, and it looks incredible, and it just blows my mind what they were able to accomplish in the late 60s with that. Then, of course, nearly a decade later, we have George Lucas's first Star Wars film, A New Hope, and this film continued the trend of miniature effects in a space environment and enhanced it as well. They came up with a motion control camera system where they were able to computer control the camera to repeat movements so that they could shoot miniatures in different lighting environments, and then once they had all the elements they needed, they could combine those with other shots. So then you would get your shots of a X-wing fighter dive bombing on the Death Star and the TIE fighters shooting the X-wings. I mean, really, really remarkable stuff. And again, this is all pre-CG. We're not talking about George Lucas's special edition of A New Hope. We're talking about the original New Hope where there was no computer graphics enhancement. Everything was analog. Everything was photochemically based. Pictures shot on stages and combined, photochemically. At the time, that was the process. Actually, the first film to digitally combine elements was Terminator 2. So since 1991, elements of film in terms of visual effects have been combined digitally. But prior to 1991, things were photochemically combined with an optical printer. And, a lot of work, a lot of detail had to be followed to make sure there were no mistakes. To wrap up my thoughts about Star Wars, it combined a lot of really great visual effects techniques. Obviously, you had full scale sets, you had miniatures, and then there was post production animation where the lightsabers were cell animated. Whether it's a blue lightsaber, a green lightsaber, a red lightsaber, that was all added in post production. But I know when I saw it at 6 or 7, it blew my mind, and it still does. It's going to forever be part of my childhood.
Yeah, same here. In 1977, that was a really special year. I mean, you had Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind in the same year. So we had Douglas Trumbull coming back again to work in visual effects with Close Encounters. He talked to Spielberg about shooting it on 70 millimeter so he can capture all those details and with clarity. And as you're saying, mixing in the optical printer, all the work that goes into transposing those into the other image where actors are perhaps in the foreground and things of that sort. It's really spectacular visuals in that film. The mothership at the end of the film, all the detail that you see in that, the smoke effects with the clouds using tanks with smoke inside of
Yeah.
it. So
Yeah. They used liquid tanks and they would pour like milk and like swirl it up and then they shot it and it looked like clouds forming.
yeah, which are always impressive to see in Spielberg's films when you have the cloud effects that
Yeah.
started pretty much with that film. Anyway, another groundbreaking film that year. 2001 was a huge step forward from everything that came before it, and then Star Wars: Close Encounters were the next stage toward getting next level photorealistic. type effects.
So, a film that is in my list of favorites that we've touched on before is Ridley Scott's 1982 Blade Runner. It's a great example of how skilled Ridley Scott is of building worlds, whether it's Alien or in this case, Blade Runner. He works with incredible set designers and artists that come together and create these remarkable environments that just look extraordinary, and Blade Runner is no exception. And then for things that can't be accomplished on a soundstage, the visual effects team comes in, and in the case of Blade Runner, the visual effects team was able to create the futuristic Los Angeles that's overpopulated, retrofit buildings where these old buildings have all kinds of additional cables and air conditioners and boxes attached to them, because instead of tearing them down and rebuilding, they just add to them. And then the space vehicles or the flying vehicles in the film, the spinners, those were both full size on set and then miniatures used in the visual effects process. And Douglas Trumbull again worked on Blade Runner to amazing results. It's one of those films I saw as a preteen. Maybe I was an early teenager, maybe 13, but it stuck with me for life. Those visuals, the score of Vangelis and seeing the spinner fly through the streets of LA in the future, it's just something I could never forget. And I got to add too the Tyrell Pyramid. That's just one of those incredible miniatures that looks so darn good. And when you have people like Doug Trumbull and his team smoking the environment where they're filming it, lighting it just right, it just looks so damn good on film. And the fact that they shot the effect shots on 65 millimeters certainly helped, so that when the optical printer process was completed, they still have some great resolution of those finished effect shots.
Yeah, I mean, Blade Runner, you believe that world exists, and even though we've passed 2019 and it's not quite like that, it still feels like it could be a future of some kind. Maybe it's like I said in an earlier episode, maybe it's more like 2099. But asking AI about it, it'll probably tell you when it might actually happen based on our trajectory. But we'll have to see. But yeah, it sells it completely. Using special effects to create worlds, a lot of times you get a sense that something kind of manufactured about it, unless it's something that's actually been shot in the real world. Even models you can kind of see looks like it could be something that's duping for something else. But when you shoot things in camera that are meant to be in the world and tangible, again, that authenticity kind of plays through. And that was the approach for the visual effects in Jacob's Ladder, to do as many of them in camera as possible. So you get this sense of things that are not of this world, but that are still grounded in the reality in some sense. And so they're odd little moments that flicker through the film, something that's kind of in the corner of the eye. You can't even quite place it. It's a character moving too fast, perhaps doing the film speed to create the effect. Other times you have strobe lights and things of that sort where you just see a flicker of something flashing in, flashing out, using some of those same effects that Malays used back in the original days of his magic tricks on film. So using those effects though to create this sense of something beyond our reality, it gives it this quality to it that is very tangible, that is unsettling. And whenever possible, if a filmmaker can do that and not go to the computer graphics, which we're going to talk about in a second, but it does help. And Christopher Nolan is a bit of a believer in that as well, that whenever you can do something in camera, you should do it. And Jacob's Ladder is sort of a treatise on why that's the case. So now moving back into CGI, we mentioned before about the use of CGI at the opening credits of Vertigo. That was sort of an initial toe in the water for CGI. Years later, in the 70s, for the original film of Westworld, which wasn't as famous when it came out as it is now because of the series on HBO that was made later. Michael Crichton, who went on to write Jurassic Park, had a park that went haywire long before the dinosaurs did it in that novel. And so Westworld was a film that he directed. It wasn't based on a book that he'd written first this time, where there were various worlds. There's Future World, Westworld, and the robots start going haywire and attacking the guests. So we see that format being a successful structure for storytelling, obviously, with Jurassic Park. And that one we had the pixelated point of view of Yul Brynner's malfunctioning robot as he's hunting one of the main characters. When we see through his field of vision, we have this computer generated effect of the world that he's seeing. So that was the first use in the story part of a film of CGI that I'm aware of. And then we go from there.
In 1982, the folks at Disney brought us the original Tron film. This film made really groundbreaking use of computer graphics, where you had human actors in costume shot on a stage, and then in post-production, they would combine that footage of the human actors with CG renderings, very primitive. The computers were quite slow. Must have taken forever for some of their shots to get rendered, but it was a great experiment. And I think we can agree the visuals in the subsequent two Tron films were better, but we can't discount the initial first steps of what they accomplished with the first Tron movie. So 3 years after Tron, Industrial Light and Magic delivered the first computer-generated character in a film, and that film was young Sherlock Holmes. And the character was a stained glass knight that we see literally pop off of a stained glass window and then land inside a church and then walk. And then we're able to see the front of it, and then we go around and we see the back of it, and we're able to see it's, very thin, but from the front or back, it looks like kind of a humanoid knight character. But very revolutionary, very, again, early days of CG, but very effective. And I think it holds up really well considering what the technology was at the time.
So the animation that's done there becomes a bit more literal in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, where you've got obviously some live action characters played by Bob Hoskins, among others, Christopher Lloyd, and so forth. And you have characters that are right out of Disney and Warner Brothers cartoons, sometimes in the same scene, like Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny, both offering to help Bob Hoskins as he's falling out of a building. Wants a parachute, and they end up not helping him out so much. Anyway, to create that world, you have to at one point have Bob Hoskins' character go into an animated world, and then at other points you have to have animated characters interacting with our worlds. There's been films that came before it that blended animation and live action, but not to the degree where you have the interaction between the world. You have penguins that are carrying trays of drinks to people in the bar. Bob Hoskins has Roger attached to his wrist with a pair of handcuffs, and he's dunking his head into the water as these weasels are looking to find Roger. He pops his head back out of the water. Roger spits water. So there's all these interactions that you have to be able to pull off that don't obviously have the capability in the real world because we don't have animated characters running around everywhere. So to create that reality, all the gags that they had to do to pull that off with practical effects must have been just such a chore to put together hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of those things throughout the film. What a landmark.
It was. Industrial Light and Magic was very involved in the effects on Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Once again, Industrial Light and Magic set some new technological standards with The Abyss in 1989, James Cameron's film. And as we discussed previously, James Cameron is always one to push the envelope when it comes to technology and film. And so for The Abyss, there's a sequence with a water tentacle or pseudopod that is controlled by these aliens in the film. And the water comes out of this moon pool in this underwater rigging station and floats through several chambers until it reaches a room where you have actors including Ed Harris and Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio. And at the time did some really state-of-the-art scanning of the actors' faces. So the pseudopod actually mimics the faces of Ed Harris and Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio and does feel very realistically. And it's an effect that, like the T-1000, it holds up really well, even though we're darn near 40 years. Yeah, darn near 40 years from that shot in The Abyss. But it's remarkable. It helped sell the illusion of what the NTIs were capable of in that story. And it helped set new ground and really established ILM as a powerhouse, which they continue to prove themselves to be. Terminator 2, 1991. ILM, again, we've talked about the T-1000 liquid metal mimetic polyalloy character played by Robert Patrick, combination of CGI and then prosthetic props created by Stan Winston Studio. Jurassic Park, 1993. This is, I think, where ILM really broke new ground because they created organic creatures, the creatures, of course, being the dinosaurs. And Stan Winston Studio created the live action dinosaurs that were used for several shots. There's one shot in the film that I love, and it's the T-Rex attack scene where the camera's inside the Ford Explorer with Sam Neill and Jeff Goldblum's characters. And the audience, the camera's almost like the audience sitting in the back seat. And we see the T-Rex come towards the car, and that's the CG T-Rex created by Industrial Light and Magic. Then we see the T-Rex at another angle, and that's a Stan Winston created T-Rex head and neck. And then we see the T-Rex move again, and that's ILM's version of the T-Rex again. So in one shot, we have the Stan Winston version and the Industrial Light and Magic computer generated version. And it's just like the perfect example of the combination of practical and computer generated effects in one shot. And, Spielberg, like Christopher Nolan, I think Spielberg loves to do as much practically as he can, and really excited to see what he delivers this summer with his new film, Disclosure Day. Continuing the conversation about computer generated imagery, the first computer generated animated feature was Pixar's Toy Story from 1995. Pixar has been able to enhance their technology, their computer systems, and the look of the films overall. But go back to 1995, even though Toy Story may not look as advanced as the later films do, the heart is still there. The story's still there. You care about the characters. You love the music. You love the characters. And it delivers for the audience. And we've touched on Weta's work in the Lord of the Rings films. But again, Gollum was the first organic character Weta created, and Andy Serkis delivered the performance in the terms of motion capture, and then the skilled animators at Weta were able to create the final animated version of the Gollum character. And I should also add that Andy Serkis did the voice of Gollum in addition to the physical performance. So, like you touched on, Mike, Andy Serkis deserves a lot of credit.
Absolutely. So now that we've covered a lot of the CGI progression over the years, it's time to get to the most important visual effect of all, which is performance. The first stage of performance is starting with the elements that you already want in the character that the actor actually has. So the easiest way to go about it is typecasting. So obviously, casting is getting a little bit more attention now that it's being approved for an Oscar statuette along with all the other categories that we've talked about over the last few videos. But when you talk to a lot of people, the common person will say, well, the most important elements of a movie, it's script and it's casting. And actually, you might be surprised that there are a decent number of directors who agree with that substantially. For instance, I know Ridley Scott doesn't really like to give a lot of directing on set to the actors. He's figured that I hired these people for what they're bringing to the table, and I shouldn't have to tell them a great deal of stuff. So casting is very important. And sometimes, though, you don't want to necessarily just make the obvious choices for things. And we'll get into that in a bit. But initially, we will talk about typecasting. So, Tom Cruise, when you're casting him, you want confidence, you want brashness, you want intelligence. Obviously, playing off of his good looks as well comes into play. So, unless you want to give him a lot of makeup to change that, but again, you would be going against the natural charisma that he brings. So, for instance, if you have something like Born on the 4th of July, yeah, you can change him to where he's a veteran who comes from home from war and he's been damaged from the war, but underneath it all, he's still the young man that in the early part of the film was the Tom Cruise that we know and love from Top Gun. So, in a sense, you're typecasting him to play that role because you know where he's going to start from. And even as he changes over the course of the story into a disabled veteran who is struggling with that change in his life that he never expected. It's an interesting transition for the Tom Cruise that we know to go through that for us. And probably would have, again, as I stated in an earlier episode, he probably would have gotten the Oscar for it if he hadn't been up against Daniel Day-Lewis in My Left Foot. Similarly, Mission Impossible, totally natural that he would be that kind of action hero lead character for that series. And obviously, he's taken that on for many years now to great financial success in that typecast performance. On the actress front, Julia Roberts from Pretty Woman on, she immediately was America's sweetheart from that movie and numerous romantic comedies that she could play in ad nauseum. So if she's in something like Notting Hill, playing an actress who has been in a lot of romantic comedy roles and dealing with the difficulties of being followed around by paparazzi, this is something that she's typecast for very well, being that that's kind of who she is in real life. And this is what we would expect from Julia Roberts. So brilliant casting.
When you hear the name Dirty Harry, most people immediately think of Clint Eastwood. Clint is also known for westerns, including the Man with No Name films that were shot in Italy. So Eastwood got his start in westerns, and that easily transitioned into the Dirty Harry role, where he ended up doing several films as Dirty Harry. Harrison Ford, we loved him as Han Solo in the Star Wars films. Luckily enough, George Lucas and Steven Spielberg were smart enough to cast him as Indiana Jones. So we got Harrison playing two tough guys in two different series of films, and the audiences obviously fell in love with both those characters.
What's funny about that is George Lucas, because he had worked with Harrison Ford in Star Wars, he didn't even want him to be Indiana Jones initially. So he was resisting it. And actually, people were saying, come on, Harrison is
Mhm.
natural for Indiana Jones. Use him, use him. So they cast Tom
Okay.
Selleck. They were going to shoot with Tom Selleck, and then Tom Selleck was locked into Magnum
Mhm.
PI, and so he hadn't even
Mhm.
started with Magnum PI on TV, but he was contractually obligated to be in it, and so
Okay.
he had to bow out. So then they had to go back and like, okay, well, who are we going to do? We're wanting to get this thing shooting soon, and Harrison Ford, Harrison Ford. So obviously, the audition for Indiana Jones was Han Solo, and it's so obvious and was perfectly correct that they ended up going that route.
Yeah, cannot imagine anybody else in either of those roles. So, Keanu Reeves in 1994, he did Speed. Fun action film, great role for him. 1999, he got The Matrix, great sci-fi action that led to two sequels. But then in 2014, he got the first John Wick film. And I think his career was a little slow following the Matrix films before John Wick took over. And I've got a lot of respect for him. I think, let's just be honest and say he's not the best of actors. But when it comes to the John Wick roles and some of what he did in the Matrix films, he's really good at body control. And he seems to be really good at memorizing the choreographed fight scenes, which to me would be really difficult to do. Plus, Keanu Reeves looks great in a suit, and it's kind of like a James Bond role in a way. He looks great in a suit, preferably a black suit, black shirt, and he just does such a great job with the firearms and the choreography, and I got a lot of respect for him because he really delivers in those action films.
Yeah, and you know what? Initially, it was in Point Break, and he has the line of "I'm an FBI agent," and it's just like I'm not sure I buy this persona, but you are correct that over time he got over the kind of bro Keanu character, that aspect of his persona, and the physicality of Keanu, he kept going at it again and again.
Mhm,
Speed was next, and then The Matrix. And it's like eventually we kind of saw it like, yeah, you know what? That
mhm,
physicality that he has is actually perfect for what he's being in these types of films. So,
yeah.
yeah, I guess again, just if people aren't getting it, you just keep trying until it clicks. And then by the time John Wick came around, people are just loving Keanu, and people forget about the fact that everybody gave him such a hard time for the fact that his
Mhm.
most convincing performance was in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure as kind of a dolt. So, you know,
Right.
so then of course you also have supporting performances that are equally important to have an identifiable person that brings a certain character because sometimes you don't even have much time to develop that character. So you want to really kind of a little bit of a relationship with him to begin with. So we knew Tommy Lee Jones long before The Fugitive as being this very blunt kind of
Tough guy.
yeah
Man of few words.
all that, yeah, just this kind of gruff character that doesn't take much off of anybody. And in The Fugitive, people were raving about Harrison Ford in that as again playing typecast as the kind of hero character, but Tommy Lee Jones stole every scene. So he ended up winning the
Yeah.
Oscar for that. And even though it wasn't really an Oscar type film, it was very much a entertainment, non-art type performance. He
Mhm,
was so entertaining for people that people were lauding him, and he was just the guy to give the award to that year.
mhm.
Same thing in The Line of Fire. You when you have your Clint Eastwood hero character in the lead, you wanna have a good foil for him, and John Malkovich always had this kinda strange air about him of like, wow, what kind of a person would he be like if he played some kinda crazy maniac who's trying to assassinate the president or something like that. So, in Line of Fire, you get that entirely. I mean, it struck gold with audiences, and a lot of people probably didn't even know him in the mainstream that much just as a name, but when you put a person like that into a pop culture film with a major actor, it's like a combination from heaven that everybody just has to see how that chemistry between those two is going to play out in the film, and it worked marvelously in that one. Then we get to someone like Meryl Streep. I mean, she's typecast in everything because she could play anything. So
She can do it all.
she could play an Australian woman losing her child to a dingo, and she can play a woman who's lost her kids in the Holocaust and every era and every type of thing. She could play Margaret Thatcher under tons of makeup. So there really is no way that you can not find the right role for Meryl Streep. She can do anything.
Robert De Niro's kind of tough guy persona was put to good use in Meet the Parents in the year 2000, the first of several films. In fact, I saw we're getting another Meet the Parents film coming up here pretty soon. Anyway, his delivery, his demeanor in the film as this retired CIA agent made for a lot of laughs, a lot of uncomfortable laughs, but it was actually a pretty clever film, and he did a great job. And a lot of those laughs are because of him, and the way he says Fokker too, you know? When he says the name Fokker, it's hard to keep a straight face when he says that
Yeah, and
name.
it's not even his type of film. I mean, all of his
No.
films are these serious drama performances where he's very, like, intense. So, when he
Yeah.
puts that into a comedy, it's just like comedy gold.
Yeah. So, in 1987, former military veteran R. Lee Ermey was hired by Stanley Kubrick to work on Full Metal Jacket. And there's several scenes where he stands out, but the primary areas where I think he's most amusing is scenes where he's screaming at the troops and saying just horribly nasty and vulgar terms. Basically, the idea is to break these men down, mold them into killing machines. That's what the Marine Corps is really about, and what their goal is with these troops, these recruits. And Arlie Ermey apparently had a great relationship with Stanley Kubrick, who's really entertained by what Ermey brought to the picture in terms of dialogue and performance, and actually rewrote a lot of the scenes where his character was used, and was a great consultant, I think, to Stanley Kubrick in the making of that film.
Even though he'd acted before, I mean, he had a scene in Apocalypse Now, if you recall, where he was flying one of the helicopters.
Yeah, that's right.
And, he was just a technical advisor on the film initially, so he wasn't
Hmm.
supposed to play this role, but he was
Mhm.
going around berating the extras using all of his expertise as a drill instructor from when he actually was one, and that's what got Kubrick's attention. They ended up saying, "You know what? We don't need the guy who we cast. Let's use you." And then here, though, you're getting to the question of, are we really even typecasting at this point, or are we just capturing what he really is, because he was that in
Mhm.
real life.
Right.
So we're getting almost to the point of like the non-professional aspect of him. This
Mhm.
is who he is
Mhm.
from reality. So we're getting kind of a fudging there, even though he is a professional actor. We're in that gray area of that reality.
It's hard to think of Full Metal Jacket without R. Lee Ermey, and I remember when my father saw the film, he was very entertained by Ermey's performance. He laughed out loud because my dad had gone through that as a Marine. He'd gone through that basic training, and he had similar things, yelled and sworn at him that we see in the film. My dad, I remember him telling me, he said that Kubrick and Ermey just hit the nail on the head. It was just perfection in terms of what these drill instructors do to these kids.
So now let's take the casting equation and let's turn it on its head. A lot of people would say, especially people in Hollywood would say, why do we want to put someone in a role that is against type when audiences don't want to see them play that? They want to see the thing that they're expecting. So let's take Tom Cruise as an example. Putting Tom Cruise in to play Lestat in Interview with the Vampire. People are wondering what is in Tom Cruise's filmography that would say he could play an aristocratic vampire at all. And apparently Anne
Yeah.
Rice, the writer of the book, was one of those people, and she said this is
Mhm.
probably the worst casting that has ever happened in Hollywood history. Well, wouldn't you know it? Tom Cruise is a real actor. And believe it or not, he pulls that off, that performance. And
Yeah.
some of that charisma that he has as a modern late 20th century individual somehow
Mhm.
comes across in this aristocratic character that's been alive for decades on end. So it's very interesting when it happens that you get that who would have thunk it
Mhm.
kind of thing that
Mhm.
happens in a film with against type performance. So another case in point is if you can use some of the qualities that make that person what they are in so many of their films, in this case, Tom Cruise, charisma and father complex, you can use
Mhm.
it even when they play the anti-hero or an antagonist type character. So in Magnolia, his Frank TJ Mackey character is very distasteful, very
Mhm.
crude. Tom Cruise, you get the sense that he's got that flash of a smile and he's nice. And here he's using it to make money and to just basically deal with his demons in front of all these people. And who would have thought, again, that would be so effective in this kind of monstrous performance? But apparently, he really got into it, even writing a lot of his lines of what he's saying. And boy, does it work. And again, he could have won an
Yeah.
Oscar for this. Probably should have. Didn't happen for him again. Maybe one of these days he'll get one. But just again, masterfully taking that persona and using it in different ways is really what makes it interesting.
Yeah, the scene where he's bedside with his estranged father and he breaks down, that's remarkable acting. It really is. I think we've touched on it in previous episodes, but the story I heard was he kind of harnessed the emotions of his actual relationship with his biological father, who left Tom's mom and his siblings when they were young. Another performance of his that I really admire is Collateral, where he's basically playing the heavy. And he does such a great job of playing this evil hitman Vincent. Incredibly believable. It's not a role we're used to seeing him in. And going back real quickly to Interview with the Vampire, Anne Rice was subsequently very impressed with his performance, and I understand she took out a full page ad in Variety to apologize and basically say Tom is Lestat. And what a hell of a way to make amends with him. It took a lot of oomph on her part to do that.
So sometimes you just get those great results from defying expectations. Another case of that, Glenn Close in Fatal Attraction. Nobody had this in their mind that Glenn Close was anything other than this saintly type character that she was nominated for Oscars in like The Big Chill, The Natural, and so forth. Yeah, who would have thought that she would be able to pull off a scorned lover who then goes psychotic to get revenge on the man who spurned her and gone back to his family. So this film was such a hot topic film in the 80s when it came out. And part of it was just this nightmare scenario that she created. And she pulled it off so successfully. You understood her, you sympathized with her to a certain degree, but at the same time, I think the men in the audience, when this film came out, probably a lot of uncomfortable rides home with their wives.
Absolutely.
Wives were noticing their husbands were very, very quiet, on the way home and, with this nightmare scenario. So, yeah, it was definitely without her performance going just completely unhinged in some of the scenes that she does, and she made a career out of that then after that. She wasn't playing saints anymore.
Yeah.
Dangerous Liaisons, the nasty marquise that she plays in that film, playing all the mind games with people, she was perfect in that. Cruella, later on in 101 Dalmatians, she took that persona even to other pop culture type films. So again, when an actress can recreate themselves like that and show their range, I mean, she's near Meryl Streepish, I'd have to say, if not right on with her and her capabilities. And that film showed it. And thank God they
Yeah,
gave her the chance.
absolutely. So Michael Keaton got his start in comedies. Some that stand out are Mr. Mom, Gung Ho, and one of my favorites is actually Night Shift. I love his role in Night Shift. And in probably 1988 or so, he gets cast as Batman. And I was really excited about the film and the furor that occurred when he was announced as the choice for Batman. It was just kind of over the top and ridiculous. And then the photos started coming out. One photo in particular had Keaton in his bat suit. And I think people were looking at that going, oh, okay, well, he looks badass. They're taking a pretty serious approach to the subject matter. It's not going to be a campy Batman film. So, and then when the film came out, I think people realized, you know what? He pulled it off. He was a great Batman and he was a great Bruce Wayne. And he went off to do one more Batman film after that. Again, guy that gets his start in comedy, gets this huge role with Batman, but does an incredible job with it and sells it.
Yeah. So then Ben Kingsley as Gandhi, you can't get more iconic than that. And he took that persona and in Schindler's List, he was very sympathetic as the guy who was kind of the right hand to Oskar Schindler in their benevolent strategy to save as many Jewish people from the Holocaust as they could. Then in 2000, he's in a film called Sexy Beast, where he plays one of the most monstrous characters I think I've ever seen in a film. Just a complete raving lunatic and sells it so much that, I mean, I did not think that he had that capacity from Gandhi to have this kind of animalistic rage and violence that his character just conveyed. So again, these actors, typecasting is just not fair to them. I mean, they really can cover the gamut if they are a true actor of that caliber. They'll be able to bring it, and Hollywood shouldn't just pigeonhole them. It may be easy for the box office to be able to rely on that kind of
Mhm.
performance to get people into the seats, but it really does a disservice to their practice, to their art, for them to be pigeonholed like that.
Like Michael Keaton, Adam Sandler is another actor that got his start in comedy, but has worked his way into dramatic roles. Just touching on his comedy films really quick. Happy Gilmore, he had a comedic dramatic role in Punch Drunk Love. But in Uncut Gems in 2019, very intense role. He was a jewelry diamond dealer, if I remember correctly, and really great role for him. Was he nominated for an Oscar? Do you remember?
He did not get nominated for it, which is kind
Did
of
he? See, that
unbelievable.
that's a huge mistake.
Huge
Yeah, that
disservice
was a
there.
huge mistake. It was, because he certainly deserved it. Another actor that has comic roots that got into dramatic films was the late Robin Williams. Good Morning Vietnam, Dead Poets Society got him into the dramatic roles, and then ultimately he won his Oscar for Good Will Hunting in 1997. A pretty remarkable performance in a film that was written by Matt Damon and Ben Affleck.
Yeah, another comedy actor who really hit it big in a dramatic role before all of those examples is Judd Hirsch in Ordinary People. So, Robert Redford being an actor, deciding to direct his first film, casting Judd Hirsch, I mean, he must have believed that Judd could pull it off, even though he was most famous for Taxi, a TV series where he was mostly kind of the straight man in the comedy, but pulling off the performance as a psychiatrist that tries to save the life of Timothy Hutton's character. Timothy Hutton went on to win the supporting actor Oscar for that film, actually, and very much an actor's movie. And Judd Hirsch, I mean, trying to save a youth from committing suicide, it doesn't get any more serious than that. And Judd Hirsch is just there as that sympathetic voice and on a note of humor. Very impressive.
So going from non-comedic to comedic, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about Leslie Nielsen, the late Leslie Nielsen. And earlier in his career, he had serious roles in classics like Forbidden Planet, where he was a captain of this spaceship. It's a very straight arrow role for him. But then the Zucker brothers came along and cast him in Airplane and then the Naked Gun films. It was just like a laugh a minute with him. And his delivery, this straight arrow delivery of oftentimes hilarious dialogue, it just worked so well. And he was the perfect guy for the part because of just the way he looked, the way he delivered his dialogue. In my humble opinion, his Naked Gun films are far better than what we recently saw with Liam Neeson. No disrespect to Liam Neeson, but Leslie Nielsen is Frank Drebin.
Absolutely, he's Frank Drebin, and the stoicness that he has comes from the dramatic acting, but just changing the situation makes all that straight-laced delivery funny. So, there's a story apparently when he was in the film Nuts with Barbara Streisand, he's the John that she kills she was abused as a child, they get into it, and his behavior to her sets her off and she ends up killing him. So, apparently, the makers of Naked Gun and Airplane, when they saw him in Nuts, which is this extremely serious performance, and they're laughing because he's in it in this different context. And, again, it's hard to watch him in Forbidden Planet now and things like that. And that's after seeing The Naked Gun. That's how far he succeeded in this completely opposite thing of what his entire career was beforehand. Unbelievable.
Thanks to Leslie Nielsen, I'll never be able to stay straight faced when I hear the term nice beaver.
Yeah. Just got it stuffed last winter.
Exactly.
Now, having to shift gears from that
From the
into
nice beaver.
yes, to interior versus stagecraft acting methodology. So clearly, before you hear things from method acting that was to bring greater realism and subtlety to performance in film, the more traditional acting was the rave. And so we get a lot more of these bigger type performances, the over emoting, the Charlton Heston like staunchness, Laurence Olivier and Hamlet, things like that. And actually, it's fun to watch Robin Williams kind of mock the Shakespeareanism of things, in which case, maybe even done that in Dead Poet Society, I think. But seriously, there was a transition period for that, and nobody gets greater credit for it than Marlon Brando with the performance in A Streetcar Named Desire, which is a play. So he would have done this on stage first, but the idea was to bring an interior aspect of the emotion of the actor from within instead of pushing out of performance like on stage, like you're projecting to the last row of the room kind of a thing. So film is more subtle because you can get the close up, you can get in there, you can do more with the look than you can even with sometimes dialogue coming out of the person's mouth. So if you don't get that on the stage, no one in the back row can see a grimace or a wince or things like that. So maybe the front row could see it, but not the back row. That was the big shift. And so on the waterfront with Elia Kazan directing was certainly another step in that direction. And that performance is a landmark. And I think you could look at virtually anything he does in that movie, except maybe for the I could have been a contender speech as being the method. If not the method, then maybe another form of internal acting, which actually Brando seemed to endorse more, which is the Stella Adler technique. Method acting is about looking into your personal experience and then using that to just drive what you're contemplating as you're emoting in the scenes. This was a perspective developed by Lee Strasberg, and people might know him from Godfather 2. He played Hyman Roth in that film, the guy who was actually trying to kill Michael Corleone. And incidentally, Al Pacino was a person who studied under Lee Strasberg, and he advocated for Coppola to hire him to be
Mhm.
in Godfather 2. And then they were both nominated for the Oscars from that film together. But the idea there is the actor over the course of the performance, there's an arc where they're building to that scene when they finally have some kind of internal climax and they build to that. So Pacino definitely in Godfather 2, you get that. So the scene when Kay tells him that she aborted his son and she would not bring another Corleone into this world, and you just see him growing into a rage and then leaping across the room to slap her across the face. That is the
Mhm.
method, okay? Because it's just you can feel the internal explosion building in Michael. So, but that's not what Brando really believed in. He's like, I don't want to go back and think about something that hurt me as a kid and that my character is going to react because of how I felt as a kid. He goes, that's not what it's about. The question is what in this moment of this scene does the character have that drives him? So the Stella Adler technique is to look at your environment of your story and say, who am I in this environment? So on the waterfront, I am a worker on the docks and I'm a part of this labor union. And this is the only opportunity I have for work. And how do I feel about this being my world? And how am I going to act if I'm this person going through all of this? So the only point where it gets too flowery probably is I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody instead of a bum. I mean, it's just a little too poetic there to be the
Mhm.
reality of his character, but everything else is pretty much on the nose. He's in that moment. And that's what he brought. I mean, he would, if he had to morph himself to be the Godfather, put cotton into his cheeks. If I'm this age and I'm carrying this much weight and all this, am I this mafia don going to be? Not how does Marlon Brando think a mafia don is going to be in this situation. So with that
Mhm.
comes study. You have to figure out who are these people. So a lot of the people that use these techniques, they go out and they try to figure it out. It's Robert De Niro driving a cab around a bunch to
Mhm.
figure it out, how to be a taxi driver, for instance. So those are the ways that they go about it, and that is their science.
Yeah, speaking of Robert De Niro, in his preparation work for Godfather 2, he apparently lived in Sicily for months in order to perfect the Sicilian dialect for his work on that film. You mentioned Taxi Driver, drove a cab. For his role as Jake LaMotta in Raging Bull, he gained a ton of weight, I believe like 60 pounds. And I think what they did is they actually filmed some and then shut production down so he could gain the weight. And then they shot him as a heavy Jake LaMotta. He gained weight again for The Untouchables in order to play Al Capone. And then in Cape Fear, he gets completely ripped. And at that time, he probably was, what would he have been? Probably in his late 40s, early 50s when he played Max Cady in Cape Fear. In conjunction with his physique and the fake tattoos, he had an intimidating look that he brought to the role. Also, for his role as Max Cady in Cape Fear, De Niro hired a dentist to shave his teeth down. And then after he performed the role, he subsequently had his teeth fixed. But it just shows you what the man was willing to go through to get that character on film the way he thought it would work.
So, in terms of commitment to research, nobody beats Daniel Day Lewis. For My Left Foot, he was in a wheelchair during the entire production and would have crew members spoon feed him as if his character would be treated in such a way. For Last of the Mohicans, he went out into the wilderness for a month and hunted everything that he would eat. For The Crucible, he built the house that he lived in using 17th century tools and proceeded to live without any running water or electricity. Incidentally, Arthur Miller was the author of the Crucible play, and his daughter Rebecca Miller ended up marrying Daniel Day-Lewis after that film. So the question is, was he still in character when he decided to marry Rebecca Miller or not?
Good
so,
question.
interesting question. Yes. So you can't beat him for commitment. I know he's in semi-retirement right now. Hopefully, he will have some more films that he will come back for, whether it's directed by his son or someone else, because he is truly a treasure in everything that he's ever been in.
That's true.
Going back a little bit more for Dustin Hoffman, though, he's been known to be very much of a difficult person on set. We talked earlier about Tootsie, how his persona was kind of used in that film. Talk about typecasting, I guess. That is Dustin. So, anyway, some of his interesting methods that were used. He put a stone in his shoe for Midnight Cowboy so he would have that uncomfortable pain in his foot whenever he would walk to create that limp for his Ratso Rizzo character in that film. The stories of him being exhausted on the Marathon Man set, we talked about that also previously. Um, Apparently, he claimed that he was going through a bad divorce at the time and was partying too much, and that's why he was so washed out while that film was being made, that Laurence Olivier's criticisms weren't so substantial. That was just the method. But he did actually reportedly run around set to seem exhausted before each take to be winded. So that makes sense. I don't have a problem
Mhm,
with that.
mhm.
So now during Kramer versus Kramer, though, I think we might have some issues with some of the ways that he may have treated Meryl Streep. During the scene when the glass gets smashed against the wall, that was not scripted, and she was not expecting it, and apparently some pieces of glass from the shattered goblet was in her hair after the shot. In other scenes, to get a reaction of Meryl Streep, he slapped her in the face, and in another instance, he taunted John Cazale's death from cancer, who was Meryl's boyfriend, in order to get a reaction out of her. So she went on later to say that she felt he was out of line by how far he pushed it to get a performance out of her. But sometimes directors are known to have done some of these things as well to get reactions out of actors to get into their personal life. And then in the middle of a scene, they will throw these things at them when they're not expecting it so they can get that reaction.
Another actor known for his method techniques is Jared Leto. In 2016's Suicide Squad, he played the Joker. Obviously, he had devilish antics on screen, but those devilish antics played through to his interactions with his cast members. And so the stories go that he gave Margot Robbie a live rat that she apparently kept for a while. It eventually ended up with the daughters of filmmaker Guillermo del Toro, and he was known to send bullets to Will Smith, whose character in the film is a marksman. He was known to send a dead pig to crew members. He sent out opened but apparently not used condoms,
Hopefully.
anal beads, and apparently pornographic magazines with pages stuck together. I'm sure that entertained his cast and crew members quite a bit, perhaps more than they wanted to be entertained by him.
Yes, I'm sure they were joyful to no end from that.
One last thought on Leto. When he was playing the character Wallace in Blade Runner 2049, the character's blind, and so he would wear these opaque contact lenses, literally rendering him blind. So on set, he couldn't see anything while he had these contacts in. So he's one of those that pushes the limits of creating a character and continuing that character after the director says cut.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you get the results, I suppose it's worth it. But I have to say, I feel sorry for the crew members when they have to go through that. Robert Pattinson, I guess, apparently had a comment to make about this where he found it strange that a lot of times people would embrace the method when they play assholes. So I thought that was kind of a funny
That's clever. Yeah, I
concept.
love that.
So yeah,
I
why is
love
it
that.
when it comes to like being a philanthropist, how come people don't embrace the method for that? So
Hmm.
and maybe they should give money
Exactly.
to some charity or something.
Right.
Anyway, Robert Pattinson himself has been known to go to pretty good extremes. I guess on the Lighthouse, he was eating dirt to get the character at one scene. So another point, I guess he forced himself to gag in order to regurgitate. So yeah, I'm glad I'm not an actor. Is all I got to say. I'll take writing over that. It's much less stressful.
Definitely.
So, from people acting like and learning to be the character, we can go one step further. And what if somebody actually in real life is that person? Do they have to act then at that point in order to play in a performance in a film? So, this was a concept that was explored in the 40s, in particular in the Italian neorealist movement. The film that's credited with starting that movement is called Sessione from 1943, directed by Luciano Visconti. This is a film that was based on the novel The Postman Always Rings Twice.
Hmm.
It was an adaptation that was not approved, violated copyright, and they were sued afterwards for stealing the story and then using it. But all the same, it's a great movie. The Postman Always Rings Twice is a famous film in its own right from the American version made a few years later, but I don't think it tops the original version that was done in Italian. So that film, they did use some professional actors, and then others were non-professional. Later, Visconti made a film called La Terra Trema and used all non-professionals at that point. This is a
Hmm.
similar trend that others in the movement would do. Roberto Rossellini, very famous neorealist director. A lot of people know his daughter today, Isabella Rossellini, incidentally, who he had with Ingrid Bergman from Casablanca. That's an interesting story, actually, how Bergman and Rossellini got met, but that'll have to be for another day, I think. Anyway, interesting story for anybody who wants to look that up. Scandalous. Anyway, his film Rome Open City, 1945, early post-war film. Had a mix of some professional, non-professional actors. By the time he did Germany Year Zero in 1948, again, only using non-professionals. Probably the most famous among all film aficionados of the movement is Bicycle Thieves. At one point, it was considered the greatest film ever made. It is a great film, and every actor in that is non-professional, including the lead performer. So anyway, it was a very impactful movement, and we do have echoes of it today. We'll go into in a little bit, where the mix of professional non-professionals has shown to be effective in American film. When that trend began in Italy, they started using some of it here. One of the most interesting is 1946 is the best years of our lives, which, by the way, again is another fantastic film about troops post-war and how they try to adapt to living in civilian life, the difficulties of that. So nothing is more affecting in that regard than Harold Russell's performance in the film as a man who lost both of his hands in the war. So in this capacity, they hired a non-professional actor who had never acted before and he had no hands. So what you're going through as you're watching the scenes that he's portraying are things that he's probably dealing with in his real life, and it's very effective. So he was nominated for supporting actor, and the Academy felt so strongly about his gift to film by giving this performance, they gave him an honorary Oscar thinking that he
Mhm.
wasn't going to win in the category. As it turns out, he did win. So he's one of the actors to get, actually, he's the only actor to have won 2 Oscars for the same role for that very reason. So he beat out people like Claude Rains, who was nominated for Notorious, very
Mhm.
substantial performances that he was against, and he
Mhm.
won. Fast forward almost 40 years later, another amazing story is the story of Hang S. Gore from The Killing Fields. He played a journalist, really an assistant to an American journalist in the Vietnam War. He was assisting American journalists in Cambodia at the time that the illegal bombings across the border from Vietnam were going on. So Hang S. Gore is a doctor who, during the Khmer Rouge taking over after the war, lived through the killing fields himself and lost his wife and his child there. He could not reveal that he was a doctor to save them, and therefore they died because this is how it was with the Khmer Rouge. This is how bad it was. So he lived through that. When it came time then to cast for the role, they cast someone who actually had gone through it, non-professional actor, and again won the Oscar for it. A few years later, while living in the United States, he was murdered, and it is suspected that it's possible people sympathetic for the Khmer Rouge had maybe murdered him. So,
Mm.
but anyway, fantastic performance. This is kind of a forgotten film. It was Best Picture nominee that year, but it's a very stirring film. John Malkovich is in it as well, playing a photographer who's trying to fake an ID so he could get out of the country. The character can get out of the country, and they don't succeed. So the poor guy gets
Mm.
left behind, even though the Americans are allowed to leave. And he has to then go through living in the killing fields and escaping across bodies and skulls and piles of body parts, getting
Mm.
back to escape, and is reunited with, ultimately, in the real life. This happened as well. He was reunited with the journalist that he worked with who spent much time trying to find him again, and they were reunited. So it's a really fantastic story, and that piece of reality entering the picture makes it even more interesting. So there is a lot of influence of neorealism on foreign films, which are more grounded in reality than a lot of Hollywood films. So nowhere is this more true than in Iranian cinema, which is an interesting topic right now, considering the war and everything that's been going on. Anyway, in the 90s, there's a filmmaker whose name was Abbas Kiarostami, and he created a film called Close Up, which really fudges the line between what is fiction and what is reality. In this film, it depicts a person who in life was imitating a director whose name is Matt Malboff. And he was put on trial for doing this impersonation that he was doing of a real person. So when they make the film of this story, the guy who actually did the impersonating plays himself going through the trial. They get the judge, who was the real judge, to play the judge in the movie. They get Matt Malboff to play himself in the movie. And at that point, you're going, okay, so is this a documentary, a reenactment of the story, or is this a film that's a narrative? And the line is at that point completely fudged to the point it's impossible to discern what's real and what is not. So recently, there was another film by a person who's done some of these same kind of techniques in his film. Jafar Panahi, that was nominated for the Oscar. It won Cannes Film Festival last year. It's called It Was Just an Accident. So again, a lot of non-professional actors are in this film. Director Panahi himself was arrested at one point and underwent interrogation under the Iranian regime. And this film is depicting a person who identifies his interrogator, captures him, and then decides whether he's going to kill the person who interrogated him. So the director, having gone through this himself, can probably identify what his main character of his movie is feeling, and he's putting this into the story. And of course, you can imagine that the Iranian regime is not happy that this film was put out to the world and got such acclaim. So it was not an Iranian nomination for foreign film that got it its nomination. It was actually through assistance in the production of it from France, which did all the post production work after they filmed it on the streets of Iran. So, I mean, talk about guts. This guy's going around filming this story after having already been arrested by them for the things that he's put on film. He goes and makes this film that's very inflammatory. So, one of the last examples of foreign films that use non professional actors is City of God, which is considered one of the top 25 films of all time on the IMDb list. Fantastic directing and gritty realism, filmed on the streets of Rio, totally credible. You understand the lifestyle that these people are going through, and again, taking people off the street to kind of play the very thing that they're living through. It's so tangible. Again, the reality of this narrative.
In 2017, Willem Dafoe starred in a film directed by Sean Baker called The Florida Project. And although Dafoe can be seen as the star of the film also starred a lot of non-actors, people that lived in this hotel where much of the film was shot. And the film kind of talks about these men, women, children, families that live in this hotel, which is not a very great distance from the amusement parks in Orlando, Florida, and uses these non-actors to very good effect. Sean Baker got really great performances out of these people. 2018 brought us Roma, and the star of Roma, Yalitza Aparicio, was a non-actor who was hired for the role, and she was Oscar nominated for her part in that film. 2020's film No Man Land had two well-known actors, Frances McDormand and David Strathairn, and the other cast members are non-actors. And then finally, a recent example, 2025's Marty Supreme. Kevin O'Leary, who is probably known to most people as one of the sharks on Shark Tank, but he's also quite often on the streaming business channels these days. He had a role in the film. He played the husband of Gwyneth Paltrow's character, Milton Rockwell. And he actually did a really good job. I saw the film. He's kind of playing himself, but it works for what the film required. And you look back at this list of films we just mentioned to you, and there's some really remarkable examples of people that have had no acting experience that deliver incredible performances, believable performances.
So, with the various techniques of performance we've talked about, what is the next step, especially with AI coming into the picture? Are we going to someday not be able to tell the difference between an AI performer and an actual performer? What is going to be entailed to create AI performance that can create the reality of what we're seeing in some of these performances that we're getting from either non-professional actors or actors that are digging deep to examine the reality of the situation? Can a director who's not collaborating with performers truly create the kinds of performance that they think in their mind they really want, but maybe they don't have the skills to create that on a computer? Francis Ford Coppola once said that being a director was like being in a circus, and he was the ringmaster who would corral everything into the performance of the film. So as a ringmaster, you're not performing. You're just gathering the performers together to do that performance, and through collaboration you're able to create that final product. So if all the tools are in the hands of one person or a few people behind a computer screen, is it really going to be the same at getting to the truth of what a film is showing? Or is it just going to be a bunch of weak, uninspired entertainment that just gives us a lot of eye candy to watch? So that's the question that
Mhm.
we have to ask ourselves. And so actually, I decided to ask AI some questions about this to see what AI thinks about its own progress in this regard. And so what I got was that within 3 to 5 years, the AI said that within 3 to 5 years, we will be having performance of lead character roles by artificial intelligence. And then such performers will be able to perform in all languages with no dubbing issues whatsoever that you would have if a live performer is performing instead of the construct. So A lot of the problems of creating entertainment that goes around the world is resolved by the AI being able to perform in every language at once. The prediction, though, is that by 2040, there will be 99% replacement of performance. Unless there's something done to protect the actor contingent, we'll be looking at most of our characters being AI created, and then CGI will have made its merger with performance as well. So, what you might get is a few stars that will survive that can open a picture. But other than that, we'll have to see whether we have AI stars that will match the stars that we currently have. That's where we're at.
Yeah, the AI technology is evolving so quickly. And as companies like NVIDIA and other chip makers continuously develop faster and faster chips, it's going to continue to progress. And I've got a few examples, fairly recent examples to throw out in terms of AI's use in terms of film. So, following the recent death of Chuck Norris, there were some folks that used AI to paste Chuck Norris into several films, including Rocky, Jaws, Jurassic Park, Gladiator, The Shining. If you haven't seen it, I suggest you take a look at it. It's clever. It's funny. Basically, you see Chuck Norris kick Rocky as they're running through Philadelphia. You see him kick the T-Rex in Jurassic Park and knock it down. You see him kick and knock down Maximus in Gladiator. And then see him kick Jack in the face in The Shining as Jack's face is going through the bathroom door. And I got to say, I mean, I'm watching these on my phone, but the quality in terms of putting the Chuck Norris character in the environments of these films that we're familiar with, it's pretty remarkable. Sometime prior to that, there was a AI video made with Arnold Schwarzenegger as Judy Garland in The Wizard of Oz singing Somewhere Over the Rainbow. And I think they probably had somebody dub the voice that could mimic Arnold's voice, but it's clever, it's humorous, but it gives you an idea of what the technology can do. Same thing with Arnold Schwarzenegger as George Michael singing Careless Whisper. Again, funny. It shows you how far the technology's come. A real example, I think, frightened a lot of people in Hollywood was a AI fight scene between Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise. This was a few months ago. And I remember reading the trades when this video came out and went viral. A lot of industry people were quite freaked out by it. And the representatives of Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt, I'm sure they were a little bit freaked out about it too, because here you have these two world famous actors and their likeness is being used without permission and without any compensation. And then finally, and this is a real timely story, just in the news in the past week or two. So prior to his death, Val Kilmer had agreed to star in a film called As Deep as the Grave. And unfortunately, because of his ailing health and his eventual passing away, he wasn't able to participate in the film. But his children have agreed with the filmmakers to use AI to portray a role in this film. And I believe this film's getting released sometime later this year. So we'll soon be able to see the results of that in terms of how good it looks, how good the performance is, and then what the reaction's going to be from Hollywood and from all of us as cinema goers and film lovers. So technology is evolving quickly, daily, and it's tough to keep up with it.
The next time out, we're going to explore the capturing and editing of performance, as well as the role of dialogue and how it creates rhythm and impacts the perception of a performance. So we'll see you next time for that.
All right, this concludes episode 8 of Celluloid Dreams, the psychology of film. If you've liked what you've heard, please like and subscribe. The podcast is available on YouTube, Amazon Music, Apple Music, and Spotify. Thanks so much, and we'll see you in episode 9.
See you then, guys.